The music found him first. Not sound, not exactly. More like pressure behind the eyes, a vibration that lived beneath hearing, older than language and wider than any dimensional frequency Stephen Strange had ever catalogued. He felt it a half-second before his sling ring portal collapsed, which was precisely half a second too late to do anything about it. One moment he was mid-transit between the Hong Kong Sanctum and Kumar Taj, a routine jump across a stable corridor he'd traveled 200 times. The next, the portal's golden edges buckled, not torn, not forced, but absorbed, drawn inward like light bending around a gravity well so massive it rewrote the rules of the space around it. Strange had time to register that whatever was pulling him wasn't hostile. It was simply so ancient, so fundamentally woven into the fabric of its own reality, that his sling ring's dimensional coordinates became meaningless the moment they intersected with it. He hit the ground hard. Wet grass, cold air carrying the smell of pine and rain, and something floral he couldn't name. The cloak of levitation snapped instinctively around his shoulders, breaking the fall with a firm upward tug before releasing him to his feet in one fluid motion. Strange stood very still for 3 seconds. A habit. Assess before you act. Rolling hills stretched in every direction, luminously green beneath a sky that held clouds like brushstrokes, enormous, unhurried, almost theatrical in their beauty. No city, no technology, no dimensional signatures he recognized. The ambient energy here didn't move the way energy moved anywhere else he'd encountered. It didn't pulse or radiate. It sang. A frequency so deep and pervasive, it was less a sound than a structural feature of reality itself, threaded through the soil and the air, and the particular quality of light falling between the clouds. He raised his hands and attempted a basic sling ring rotation. The portal opened, sluggishly, the golden sparks dimmer than usual, the aperture narrowing before it could fully form. Strange closed it deliberately. Whatever dimensional substrate the mystic arts drew from, this universe had its own competing architecture, and his tools were running through translation layers they hadn't been built to handle. Not broken, adapted. He filed the distinction carefully. His hands, the scarred, nerve-damaged hands that had ended a surgical career and begun something far stranger, tingled with the ambient vibration of this place. The energy was accessible. It simply required a different key. A road cut through the hills below him, unpaved, rutted with cartwheels, edged with wildflowers. No asphalt, no power lines. He cataloged the implications without sentiment. Pre-industrial civilization, possibly pre-gunpowder, unknown magical tradition, unknown threat landscape. The eye of Agamotto rested against his chest, warm and faintly luminous, reacting to something in the atmosphere that Strange couldn't yet identify. He started walking toward the road. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. May the Force be with you. The cloak rippled once at his back, not alarm, more like acknowledgement, and Strange allowed himself one measured breath of the cleanest air he'd encountered in any universe, before the road curved and revealed a figure in gray robes approaching from the opposite direction, leading a cart horse with patient, unhurried steps. Strange stopped walking. So did the old man. For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind moved through the grass between them.
The old man's eyes were the problem. Strange had faced sorcerers, demigods, ancient entities wearing borrowed faces, and the living embodiment of an Infinity Stone's will. He knew how power looked when it chose to wear human features, the slight wrongness around the edges, the sense that the face was a decision rather than a fact. This man had that quality, but inverted. Where most beings who concealed power made Strange feel like he was being watched, this one made him feel like he was being read, quietly, thoroughly, without malice. The gray robes were travel-worn, the hat was absurd, the staff was gnarled wood, and Strange's diagnostic instincts registered nothing from it, no embedded spell matrix, no channeled energy, until he looked slightly to the left of looking at it. the perceptual trick Mordo had taught him in his first month at Camartage, and felt something vast and patient coiled in the wood like a river behind a dam. "You are not from here," the old man said. His voice was unhurried in the way that bedrock was unhurried. "Accurate," Strange said. "You're not entirely from here either." The old man's expression shifted, not surprise, but the careful recalibration of someone updating an estimate. He studied Strange the way Strange studied dimensional anomalies, with respect for what he didn't yet understand. "You felt the music," the old man said. It wasn't a question. "Is that what that is?" Strange kept his voice neutral. "The vibrational substrate underlying this universe's fundamental structure. I've encountered similar principles in other cosmologies. Agamotto's early texts describe something analogous, but nothing at this magnitude. Whatever sang this place into existence was working at a scale that makes most creative forces I'm aware of look like rough drafts." The old man was quiet for a moment. A small smile moved beneath the beard. "You speak of the Ainu Lindale. I don't have a name for it yet. What I have is a malfunctioning sling ring, approximately 15% reduced access to my primary energy channels, and no coordinates home." Strange paused. "I also have questions." "As do I, though I suspect mine are more urgent than you presently understand." He introduced himself as Gandalf, offered the name simply, without the titles, which Strange noted was either genuine humility or sophisticated misdirection. Strange gave his own name in return and watched Gandalf, process it with the expression of someone filing information in a system Strange couldn't access. They walked. Gandalf led the cart horse. Strange matched his pace, which was slower than he'd have chosen and faster than it appeared, and used the time to run careful perceptual sweeps of the environment. The ambient music, he was beginning to understand, wasn't uniform. It had texture. Harmony in some directions, discord in others. A directionality that felt almost navigational once he stopped trying to analyze it and simply let it register. "There is a darkness moving in the east," Gandalf said in the tone of a man mentioning weather. "I know," Strange said. He'd felt the discord sharpening on that horizon since he'd stood up from the wet grass. Something's wrong with the music there, like a theme that's been deliberately corrupted. Gandalf stopped walking. He turned to look at Strange with an expression that was no longer merely assessing. "How long," he said carefully, "have you been able to hear it?" "About 40 minutes, Strange said. Bree was loud, suspicious, and smelled aggressively of livestock, which, Strange reflected, was at least honest about what it was. Gandalf had explained enough on the road to make the village navigable, a waypoint town, mixed population of men and hobbits, and currently hosting 4 small travelers from a place called the Shire, who were carrying something Gandalf declined to specify, with a firmness that Strange recognized as non-negotiable. He'd pushed once, felt the quiet wall behind the old man's patience, and decided the information would surface when it was useful. He was more interested, for now, in the energy signature he'd been tracking since they passed through the town gate. Something was wrong with the night. Not the darkness. Strange had no quarrel with darkness. It was the quality of attention within it, a focused, ancient wrongness pressing against the edges of his perception, the way extreme cold pressed against skin. Not aggressive yet, but promising. He kept the observation to himself and followed Gandalf into the prancing pony, where a young man with ranger's eyes clocked Strange's arrival with the practiced wariness of someone who survived by noticing things. The hobbits were easy to find. They occupied a corner table with the energetic anxiety of people trying very hard to look comfortable, which they were not. Strange ordered nothing, sat at the bar, and watched. He expanded his awareness carefully, The mystic arts ran sluggish here, but his perception was sharpening as he spent more time in the ambient music's frequency. He realized, beginning to hear it less as noise and more as information. The wrongness outside sharpened into 5 distinct points, moving, coordinated. "Gandalf," Strange said quietly. But the old man was already gone, vanished from the common room with the unpredictable timing of someone who did this professionally. Strange stood, turned toward the door, and the Nazgul came through it like smoke given malice. The common room erupted. Strange moved without deciding to move, the cloak snapping wide, his hands already pulling at the dimensional energy threading through this universe's impossible music, finding purchase in a way that felt different from anything in his trained repertoire. He shaped it quickly, instinctively, letting the local framework guide his hands rather than forcing his technique onto resistant material. The mirror dimension opened, fractured, unstable. The Ainul Nindale pushed back against the dimensional fold like a body rejecting foreign tissue, but it held for 6 critical seconds, long enough for the lead ringwraith to crash into the barrier and recoil, the focused hatred of its attention fracturing against something it had no category for. The Nazgul hesitated. That was the thing Strange had noticed immediately and catalogued with professional interest. These beings operated through dominion. They radiated the will of something that expected to be obeyed, and the expectation itself was a weapon. The hobbits flinched, the patrons fled, but the mystic arts drew from a dimensional source that predated the ring's dominion, and Strange simply didn't feel the pull. He stood in the mirror dimension's fracture edge and looked at 5 ancient servants of darkness and felt, primarily, curious. "You're not getting to them tonight," he said. The Nazgul shrieked, a sound like tearing metal and grief and cold, and the mirror dimension buckled. Strange let it collapse and replaced it with a shield construct he'd adapted on the fly, threading it through the music rather than against it, and this time it held solid. By the time the ringwraiths retreated into the dark, Strange had learned 3 things. His powers were adapting faster than expected. Whatever the hobbits were carrying, terrified entities of genuine cosmic power, and Gandalf had absolutely known this was coming.
Rivendell announced itself to Strange's perception before it came into visual range. The music here was different, clarified, like a chord resolving after a long tension. The ambient vibrational frequency that Strange had been mapping since Eriador carried a quality in this valley that he could only describe, in the vocabulary of his old life, as surgical, precise, ancient, maintained. Someone had been tending this place for a very long time. He came through the gates with Gandalf and the hobbits and the ranger. Aragorn, Strange had gathered, a name worn lightly over something considerably larger, and felt the eyes of the elves land on him with the same quality of attention he'd received from Gandalf, but multiplied, less warm, more thorough. Elrond met them in the courtyard and said nothing to Strange directly for 40 seconds. He simply looked. Strange returned the courtesy. "You are not a Maya," Elrond said finally. "No. Not a man of any lineage I recognize." Also correct. "Yet you carry power that resonates with the music in ways I have not encountered in 3,000 years of listening." Elrond's expression held no hostility, but its neutrality was itself a form of pressure. "You will explain this." "Happily," Strange said, "after the council." He'd heard about the council from Gandalf. Representatives of the free peoples of Middle-earth convened to decide the fate of the One Ring. Strange had no intention of attending as a guest. He'd attended enough interdimensional tribunal hearings to know that rooms where the future was being decided without all available information were rooms that produced catastrophically wrong decisions. He walked into the council uninvited.
The reaction was predictable. Boromir's hand moved toward his sword. The dwarven representative stood. The elven delegates exchanged looks with the speed of people communicating in a language the rest of the room couldn't follow. Gandalf, seated across the circle, looked at Strange with an expression that managed to convey both resignation and something Strange suspected was reluctant amusement. Elrond said with admirable composure, "This council was not convened for 'I've seen this war,'" Strange said. Silence. He let it settle before continuing. He'd learned, across years of Kamartaj training, the Ancient One's ruthless pedagogical precision and 14 million deaths at the hands of Dormammu, that the right silence at the right moment carried more weight than any argument. Not this exact war, he clarified, but variations. Conflicts where the fate of a world balanced on a single object of concentrated power, where one faction sought to destroy it and another sought to use it, and where good people, in rooms like this one, argued themselves into delay while the darkness closed in. He looked at each face around the circle, reading them the way the Ancient One had taught him to read dimensional signatures, finding the fault lines. In the majority of those scenarios, the people who survived were the ones who made the irreversible decision early. "You speak of destroying the ring," Boromir said, his voice carrying the tightly controlled anger of a man who'd been thinking about something else. "I speak of knowing which options are actually available to you." Strange looked at Frodo, had known which of the hobbits was carrying it since Bree, the weight of the ring's resonance distinctly audible against the music's background frequency, and which ones only feel available. Gandalf was watching him with an expression Strange couldn't fully decode. Not alarm, not approval, something more careful than either. "How many versions of this did you watch?" Gandalf asked, quietly. Strange met the old man's eyes. Enough to know which questions matter.
Galadriel summoned him at midnight, not with words, with attention. Strange felt it like a hand placed firmly on his shoulder, a directed awareness that cut through the ambient music with the precision of someone who had been listening to it since before most civilizations had learned to count. He followed it through Rivendell's moonlit corridors to a garden where starlight collected in the fountains like something deliberate, and found her waiting beside a stone basin filled with still water. He'd known she was different the moment he'd seen her at the council's edge. Where the other elves radiated the music's frequency like instruments playing their part, Galadriel conducted it, a subtle but unmistakable distinction that Strange's sharpening perception had catalogued immediately. She was the most powerful being he'd encountered in this universe, who was also unambiguously choosing restraint. That combination, in his experience, was either wisdom or fear, and everything about her bearing suggested it was not fear. "You have something that sees through time," she said, no preamble. Strange's hand moved instinctively to the eye of Agamotto. "It's more complicated than that. Show me what you showed the council, the certainty behind your words." Her eyes held the particular quality he associated with beings who had witnessed enough history to stop being surprised by it. Not the conclusion, the mechanism. "The eye manipulates time at a local level," Strange said carefully. "What I told the council came from experience across alternate timelines, not prophecy. There's a meaningful difference." "Yes," Galadriel said, "there is. Prophecy is the music heard imperfectly. What you describe is something else." She moved to the basin. "Look." Strange looked into the mirror of Galadriel and felt the eye of Agamotto grow suddenly, intensely warm against his sternum,
Two instruments of foresight recognizing each other across a cosmological distance, resonating at frequencies that made the air between them briefly visible. The mirror showed him things. He'd trained himself across years of weaponized humility at Camartage to receive visions without flinching. The Ancient One had broken that discipline in him twice before rebuilding it properly. But what the mirror offered wasn't the structured probability calculus of the Time Stones site. It was something rawer, more musical, more concerned with meaning than mechanics. He saw Middle-earth's fate not as branching timelines, but as a theme approaching resolution. He saw the ring's destruction not as an outcome, but as a note that the music had always been building toward. He also saw, in the mirror's peripheral depths, something the mirror perhaps hadn't intended to show him, a darkness outside the music entirely, a discord that predated Sauron, that had been present, Strange realized, with the cold clarity of a diagnostician recognizing a systemic condition beneath a local symptom, since before the world was sung into being. He stepped back from the basin. Galadriel was watching him with an expression that confirmed she'd seen his reaction. "You know what that is," Strange said. "We have a name for it," she said. "Morgoth, the first darkness, defeated but not unmade." She paused. "Sauron was his servant, his shadow. What you are seeing is the question that the War of the Ring does not fully answer." Strange looked at the eye of Agamotto. Its light pulsed once, slow, considered, and went still. "Your mirror," he said, "it doesn't just show futures. It showed me something that exists outside your cosmology's causal structure." "Yes," Galadriel said quietly. "That is why I summoned you at midnight rather than in the Council's daylight." She met his eyes with the directness of someone delivering a weight they'd been carrying alone. "You may be carrying the only instrument in this world capable of perceiving it clearly." Strange said nothing. The music moved through the garden around them, and for the first time since his arrival, he didn't find its depth comforting.
The Fellowship left Rivendell 9 strong, and Strange made 10. There had been no formal vote on the matter. Gandalf had raised a single measured objection, not to Strange's inclusion, but to the precedent of it, which Strange understood was a different argument. Elrond had listened, considered, and then looked at Strange with the expression of a man who had learned, across 3,000 years, to recognize when the music had already made a decision and argument was administrative theater. Strange had accepted the addition without ceremony. He had no interest in belonging to this company. He had considerable interest in where it was going. The Misty Mountains revealed themselves over 4 days of climbing, vast, indifferent, snow-weighted, and acoustically extraordinary. The music here was ancient in a way that even Rivendell's carefully tended frequency couldn't match. Raw, pre-civilizational. Strange moved through it with the methodical attention of someone cataloging a new energy system, his perception mapping the mountain's vibrational architecture with each day's ascent. The Fellowship's internal dynamics were, he noted professionally, a structural problem. 9 individuals from incompatible cultures carrying incompatible grief, organized around a chain of command that relied entirely on deference to Gandalf. And Gandalf's leadership style was the specific kind of visionary patience that worked beautifully until it didn't, at which point the gap between his long view and everyone else's immediate reality became dangerous. Strange said nothing about this. He walked near the back, observed, and let the group find its friction points naturally. The friction arrived at the gates of Moria. The argument about the road, over the mountain or through it, was, Strange recognized, not really about geography. Boromir wanted the Gap of Rohan because he wanted to go home.
Gandalf wanted Moria because the music told him something Strange couldn't yet hear. Frodo made the decision because the ring's weight was making him pragmatic in ways that should have alarmed everyone around him more than it apparently did. Strange had voted, internally, for the mountain. He kept this to himself. Moria announced its nature the moment the west gate opened, a pressure change in the ambient music that felt like a key change in a symphony, the established harmonic suddenly resolving into something in a minor register. Strange extended his perception into the dark and felt the depth of the place. Miles of worked stone, the resonant signatures of ancient craft, and beneath it all, something sleeping. Not metaphorically sleeping. He fell into step beside Gandalf as they entered and kept his voice low. There's something large in the deep levels. It's not orc. It predates the dwarven construction. I know, Gandalf said. You knew before we entered. Yes. Strange looked at him sideways. You brought 10 people, including 4 hobbits and a hobbit-sized errand, into a mountain with an ancient apex predator in the basement because the road through Moria is necessary, Gandalf said, with the serenity of someone who had made peace with the cost. And the Fellowship needed to learn what it was made of before the true trial came. Strange found this answer simultaneously understandable and maddening, which seemed to be Gandalf's consistent effect on him. They walked deeper. The darkness thickened. The sleeping thing in the deep levels stirred at the edge of Strange's perception, responding, he realized, with sharp attention, not to the Fellowship's footsteps, but to the dimensional energy Strange himself was radiating. His presence in this universe was still partially untranslated. He was broadcasting frequencies the local architecture had no template for. He was, he understood with cold precision, the one who had awakened it. The bridge of Khazad-dûm was exactly as narrow as it needed to be for this to be a problem. Strange stood at the back of the Fellowship's desperate run and watched the Balrog emerge from the dark below with the professional attention he reserved for things that genuinely surprised him. He'd encountered entities of tremendous destructive power across multiple dimensions. He'd stood in the presence of beings who predated his universe's current cosmic arrangement. But the Balrog was something different from all of them. Not external to Middle-earth's music, but within it, a Maya of Morgoth's corruption, a theme in the original composition that had chosen discord over harmony and been given physical form by millennia of darkness. It was, structurally, the most powerful thing he'd encountered in this universe, and it was moving toward Frodo. Gandalf reached the bridge first. Strange was already calculating. The mirror dimension was the obvious tool. Contain the Balrog within a folded space, remove it from the battlefield, give the Fellowship time to cross and escape. He'd used the technique against comparable threats. He opened the fold as Gandalf raised his staff, threading it through the Moria's ambient music rather than against it, finding the pathway his 3 weeks in Middle-earth had been slowly teaching him. The music rejected it. Not violently, not even with hostility. It simply closed, the way a living system encapsulated a foreign body. The Ainolindale, Strange understood in a single crystalline moment of unwanted clarity, didn't permit dimensional imprisonment of beings who were constitutionally part of its composition. The Balrog was a corrupted Maya, but it was still a Maya, woven into the fabric of this world at a level that predated the world's physical formation. Folding it into a mirror dimension would be like trying to remove a note from a song that had already been sung. The fold collapsed. Strange absorbed the rebound through the cloak, which snapped and shuddered, but held. Gandalf and the Balrog faced each other on the bridge, and Strange made the decision in the space between 1 second and the next. He could not remove the Balrog. He could not imprison it. What he could do, what the music's own architecture would permit, he understood now with the intuitive certainty of someone who'd spent 3 weeks learning a new instrument, was amplify. He moved to the bridge's edge and poured every accessible channel of the mystic arts into Gandalf's staff. Not his technique, not his dimensional framework. He fed raw energy through the local system, letting the music translate it, letting Gandalf's own profound connection to the Ainu Lindale determine the form. Strange was the power source, Gandalf was the instrument. The bridge between them hummed with a frequency that made the stone of Khazad-dûm vibrate in harmonic sympathy. The Balrog's strike against Gandalf's barrier shattered the bridge. Strange grabbed the cloak's edge and pulled, caught Boromir's arm, felt the cloak snap outward to slow their fall from the bridge's edge as the stone gave way beneath them. Around him, the Fellowship scrambled, caught themselves, reached the far side in the chaos of crumbling rock and falling flame. He looked back once. Gandalf stood at the broken bridge's end, wreathed in light Strange recognized as something more than the mystic arts he'd fed him. The old man was drawing on reserves that Strange hadn't known he possessed, burning with the terrible brightness of someone making a decision about cost. "Fly, you fools," Gandalf said, and fell. Strange stood at the edge and felt the music change, a theme resolving, a thread unspooling towards something the music apparently required. He recognized it with the grief of someone who had learned, at enormous personal cost, that some necessary things couldn't be stopped. He turned and followed the Fellowship into the dark beyond Moria's eastern gate, and said nothing, because there was nothing adequate to say.
Saruman's agents were better than Strange had anticipated, which meant he'd underestimated the intelligence network, which meant he'd been careless. The separation had happened in the grief-blurred hours after Moria's eastern gate, when the Fellowship had collapsed at the edge of the Mirror, and Strange had stepped away from the group's raw mourning to run a perceptual sweep of the surrounding terrain. Grief made him uncomfortable, not because he didn't feel it. He felt Gandalf's loss with the specific weight of losing a peer, something rarer than most people understood, but because he processed it better in motion. The agents had come from 3 directions simultaneously. Professionals. He'd managed to incapacitate 4 before the 5th had deployed something Strange hadn't seen, a device, crystalline and faintly luminous, that produced a frequency specifically tuned to disrupt the ambient music's flow around him. His access to the mystic arts dropped to approximately 40% in the space of 2 seconds. He'd been taken efficiently, which told him the device had been prepared in advance, which told him Saruman had been studying him since Bree. Orthanc was everything its reputation suggested, a tower of impractical height and considerable symbolic aggression, built by someone who understood that architecture was a form of argument. Strange was brought to a chamber near the top and left there with the crystalline disruptor mounted in the wall, and a view of Isengard's industrialized devastation that told him more about Saruman's trajectory than any intelligence briefing could have. Saruman arrived looking like wisdom and moving like ambition. "You are not what I expected," the White Wizard said, studying Strange with the focused appetite of a scholar encountering a primary source. "I have read much of the world's history. Nothing in it accounts for you." "I get that a lot," Strange said. "Your power draws from dimensional substrates that should not intersect with Middle-earth's cosmological structure." Saruman moved around the chamber with proprietary ease. "And yet here you are, adapting, learning to channel the music. I find that I want very much to understand the mechanism." Strange watched him carefully. Saruman was brilliant. The evidence of it was in the quality of his analysis, which was accurate in its details and wrong in its fundamental premise. He understood Strange's power as a resource to be studied and potentially replicated, which meant he understood almost nothing about it. "You said you've been reading," Strange said. "What exactly have you been reading about multiversal theory?" The slight pause before Saruman answered was informative.
fragments, ancient texts that the other Istari dismissed as metaphor. Who gave you those texts? Another pause, longer. Strange looked past Saruman at the palantir mounted in the chamber's far alcove, the seeing stone's surface dark, but carrying the same corrupted dissonance he'd felt on the eastern horizon since his arrival, the same frequency he saw in the mirror of Galadriel's peripheral depths. Not Sauron's darkness, older. You've been in contact with something through that stone that is not Sauron. Saruman's expression shifted, the first genuine unguarded reaction Strange had seen from him. Not guilt, something more complicated. The look of a man who had told himself a sophisticated lie for long enough that being seen through it produced not relief, but vertigo. Sauron's reach extends, Saruman began. Sauron was a servant, Strange said. You've been talking to the thing that made him one, and it's been feeding you exactly the knowledge you wanted, which means it's been feeding you exactly the knowledge it wanted you to have. He looked at the palantir. How long? The crystalline disruptor hummed in the wall. Outside, Isengard's machinery ground through the night. Saruman said nothing, which was, Strange reflected, the most honest answer he'd given.
Strange freed himself on the third day, which was 2 days longer than he'd have liked, and 1 day sooner than Saruman expected. The crystalline disruptor had been tuned to interrupt the mystic arts by disrupting the ambient music's flow around him. Elegant work, precisely calibrated, which confirmed that whatever Saruman had been speaking to through the palantir understood Strange's power at a level that should have been impossible given his 3 weeks in Middle-earth. That understanding was itself the vulnerability. The disruptor was calibrated to block his imported technique. It had no framework for what his mystic arts had become after 3 weeks of adaptation. The hybrid methodology he developed instinctively, threading dimensional energy through the music's own architecture rather than alongside it. He let the cloak handle the guards. It was annoyed about the delay and efficient about expressing this. The palantir chamber was unguarded when Strange entered it, which meant either Saruman was careless or it was a trap, and Strange had stopped assuming carelessness in capable opponents approximately 15 years ago. He approached the seeing stone with his perception fully extended, mapping the dissonant frequency emanating from its surface with the careful attention of a diagnostician reading a contaminated sample. What he found confirmed what Galadriel's mirror had shown him in Rivendell's midnight garden. The darkness threading through the palantir wasn't Saruman's will. It was older, pre-cosmic, prior to the music's first note, the silence that existed before Iluvatar's theme and had never accepted the world the music made. Morgoth's discord hadn't ended with his defeat. It had dispersed, thinned, spread itself through the world's deep architecture like a crack through stone, patient and foundational, waiting for instruments capable of amplifying it. Sauron had been one such instrument. Saruman, Strange now understood, was being shaped into another. And the darkness had noticed Strange. It came through the palantir not as an assault, but as an invitation, a focused tendril of Morgoth's dispersed will, reaching across the Seeing Stone's network with the particular sophistication of something that had been studying him. It spoke without language, communicating in the dissonant frequency that Strange's adapted perception now read with uncomfortable clarity. You are not of this music. You owe it nothing. Here is power without its constraints. Strange had stood in the presence of the dark dimension. He had negotiated with Dormammu across the full, terrible weight of an infinite time loop. He had looked into the time stone's calculus of 14 million futures and found the one that required him to lose. He looked into Morgoth's offered darkness and felt, beneath its sophistication, the same fundamental poverty he'd recognized in every entity that mistook power for purpose. "No," he said aloud, to the empty chamber and the ancient dark within the stone.
Then he picked up the palantir and did something Saruman had not anticipated. He looked into it deliberately, not to communicate with the darkness, but to map it. Using the Eye of Agamotto and 3 weeks of music-adapted perception simultaneously, he traced Morgoth's dispersed frequency through the Palantir's network, feeling it stretch across Middle-earth's deep architecture, identifying its pressure points, its concentrations, its relationship to Sauron's more localized corruption. The darkness recoiled from being examined. Ancient things, Strange had learned, were accustomed to being feared, not studied. He set the palantir down as Saruman appeared in the chamber's doorway, staff raised, expression carrying the specific fury of a man whose carefully constructed situation had been comprehensively rearranged. "What did you do?" Saruman demanded. "Diagnosis," Strange said. "You've been treated for the wrong condition." He looked at the White Wizard with something that wasn't quite pity, but occupied adjacent territory. "Sauron isn't your primary problem. He never was." He raised his hands, threaded the mystic arts through the music's architecture with the fluency that 3 weeks and 1 bridge and 1 midnight garden had built in him, and opened a portal in the tower wall. Orthanc's stone cracked around its edges. Strange stepped through. He found the fellowship at Amon Hen, which the music had been pointing him toward for 2 days like a compass needle finding north. The encampment was fractured, Boromir dead, Frodo and Sam gone east toward Mordor. The remaining fellowship split between grief and the particular purposeful momentum of people who had decided to keep moving because stopping would mean feeling everything. Strange arrived at the hill's edge and assessed the situation with the efficiency of someone who had learned to read aftermath as fluently as event. Aragorn looked at him with the measured relief of a man who had long ago stopped being surprised by the world and simply responded to it. Legolas and Gimli flanked him with the instinctive defensive positioning of warriors who'd spent enough time together to move as a unit without discussing it. Merry and Pippin were gone. Strange felt their trail in the music, moving north and west under duress. "Saruman's forces took them," Aragorn said. "I know," Strange said. "I came from Orthanc." A brief silence absorbed this. "Gandalf said you would find your way back," Aragorn said finally. Strange looked at him. "He told you that before Moria?" "The night before we entered." Aragorn held his gaze steadily. "He said you were the kind of man who moved toward problems rather than away from them, and that the Fellowship would need that before the end." Strange said nothing for a moment. The music moved around Amon Hen with the particular quality he'd come to associate with pivotal geography, places where the themes had concentrated, where the composition's major movements had been or were about to be decided. He extended his perception fully, mapping the situation with everything 3 weeks in Middle-earth had built in him. Frodo and Sam were beyond reach for now. The music surrounding Mordor was so densely corrupted that his adapted perception couldn't penetrate it cleanly. The 2 hobbits were a thread in the composition he had to trust to resolve itself. He understood, with the hard-won acceptance of a man who had learned in the worst possible circumstances that some necessary things couldn't be controlled, that Frodo's road was Frodo's road. What he could affect was here. "Merry and Pippin are alive," Strange said, "moving toward Fangorn. Whatever took them wants them breathing." He looked north. "I can track the music's disruption. Saruman's Uruk-hai carry the same dissonant frequency I mapped in Orthanc. I can follow it." "Then we follow them," Aragorn said, with the simple decisiveness of a man who had been waiting for something actionable. Strange looked at the Eye of Agamotto, warm, steady, adapted now to a cosmological framework its maker had never imagined. He looked at the cloak, which rippled once in the Amon Hen wind with what he'd privately come to recognize as its version of readiness. He looked at the 3 remaining members of the fellowship, a ranger who was also a king, an elf whose perception matched his own in its quiet precision, a dwarf whose stubborn loyalty was itself a form of power, and recognized the specific configuration of people who would see something through regardless of cost. He had fought alongside worse. He had fought alongside better and lost anyway. "One more thing," Strange said. He turned to Aragorn. "What I found in the Palantir, what's threading through this war beneath Sauron's surface, doesn't end with the ring's destruction. You need to know that going in, not to stop you, to make sure you're building something afterward that can hold." Aragorn met his eyes and did not look away. "Then help us build it." Strange nodded once. Across the brown lands to the north, the music sharpened into urgency, and the 3 hunters began to run.
The War of the Ring would be recorded in the Red Book of Westmarch, in the annals of Gondor, and in the long memory of the elves as it had unfolded, with certain omissions, certain details that resisted the clean architecture of chronicle. There was no entry for the man in the red cloak. He had fought at Helm's Deep and said nothing memorable. He had stood at the Black Gate and added his voice to no speech. He had worked quietly at the edges of every decisive moment, threading power through the world's fundamental music with the practiced precision of someone who had learned to solve problems without becoming the story. Galadriel alone left a record in the private histories of Lothlorien, a single passage noting that a traveler from beyond the known cosmology had passed through Middle-earth during its hour of decision, carrying instruments older than its music and a perspective unconstrained by its prophecies. She noted that he had helped. She noted more carefully what he had seen in her mirror's peripheral depths, the crack in the world's foundation that the ring's destruction would not close. Morgoth's dispersed discord, patient and structural, waiting in the deep architecture. Strange had left her a method, a way of listening for it, a diagnostic technique translated laboriously across cosmological frameworks during the weeks after Amon Hen, written in a script that combined the mystic arts notation with elvish characters in a hybrid language that only Galadriel fully understood. He had disappeared before the age ended. Where, the record did not say. The music, those who listened carefully reported, carried a new note for years afterward. Small, precise, distinctly foreign, as if something from outside the composition had briefly played along and left its mark on the song. May the Force be with you. More stories await.